The mansion wasn't a house, it was a kingdom, and my grandfather, Arthur Covington, was its cold, unsmiling king. And my father, Robert Anderson, spent the better part of his life plotting to tear that kingdom down, with the king still inside it. My story begins not with a bang, but with the quiet, simmering resentment that defined my childhood. We lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Ontario, Canada, in a modest bungalow with a patchy lawn and a screen door that perpetually squeaked. My father was a good man, a hard-working man. He was a carpenter, and his hands were a testament to his trade, calloused, strong, and often stained with wood varnish. He could build anything from a kitchen cabinet to a rocking horse, and he did it with a quiet pride that was his alone. But that pride seemed to shrivel the moment we turned onto the long, winding driveway that led to my grandfather's estate. Every Sunday, we would make the pilgrimage. My mother, Eleanor, would spend the morning in a state of nervous energy, pressing our best clothes and reminding me to be on my best behavior. "Please, Helen," she'd say, her voice tight, "just be polite to your grandfather." For me, she was his only child, the fragile link between two worlds that were destined to collide. In the car, a heavy silence would descend. My father would grip the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his jaw set like stone. He would stare straight ahead, his gaze fixed on the sprawling mansion that grew larger and larger in the windshield, a symbol of everything he was not, everything he could not provide. I saw the world through my father's eyes back then. I saw the injustice of it all. We struggled to pay for a new furnace one winter, while my grandfather had entire wings of his house that were heated but unoccupied. My father's truck, his most essential tool, was always in need of some repair, a constant source of financial anxiety. Meanwhile, my grandfather had a garage full of pristine, vintage automobiles he never drove. The disparity was a chasm, and my father stood on one side, looking across with a mixture of envy and pure, unadulterated bitterness. Grandfather Arthur was not a cruel man in the overt sense. He never raised his voice. He never said a deliberately mean-spirited word. His cruelty was colder, more refined. It was in the way he'd look at my father's work boots on his Persian rugs. It was in the casual, dismissive wave of his hand when my father tried to speak about his work. He'd listen with a detached sort of patience, his eyes glazed over, before changing the subject to the stock market or a recent acquisition. He made my father feel invisible. He made him feel small. The worst part was the money. Occasionally, my grandfather would offer what he called help. He would write a check with a flourish of his expensive fountain pen, sliding it across the polished mahogany of his desk towards my mother. He never handed it to my father. It was a transaction between him and his daughter, a way of reinforcing the fact that my father was an outsider, an inadequate provider who couldn't take care of his own family. My father would never say a word in that room, but the car ride home would be thick with his unspoken rage. The check would sit on our kitchen counter for days, a little slip of paper that represented both a lifeline and a profound humiliation. I remember one particular Sunday when I was about 10. My father had just finished building a beautiful dollhouse for me. It was a perfect replica of our own little bungalow, complete with tiny shingles and a miniature squeaking screen door. I was so proud of it, and I insisted on bringing it to show my grandfather. I carried it carefully into the grand library, my heart thumping with excitement. "Look, Grandpa, Daddy made it for me," I said, placing it on a low table. My grandfather adjusted his spectacles and peered down at it. He didn't touch it. "Quaint," he said, the word hanging in the air like a puff of cold smoke. "Robert, you certainly have a knack for rustic projects." The word rustic was a dagger. It was a polite way of saying crude, unsophisticated. I saw the light go out of my father's eyes. He had poured his heart into that dollhouse, into every tiny, perfect detail. And in one word, my grandfather had dismissed it as the work of a simple laborer. My father smiled a thin, brittle smile, but I saw the muscles in his jaw twitching. On the way home that night, he was quieter than ever before. When we got back to our house, he went into his workshop and I could hear him working late into the night, the sound of his saw angrier, more frantic than usual. As the years went by, my father's resentment began to curdle into something darker. My mother's health started to decline. It began subtly, with a weariness she couldn't shake, and progressed to a series of illnesses that left her frail and often confined to her bed. The medical bills began to pile up, an avalanche of paper that threatened to bury us. My father took on extra jobs, working weekends and evenings until he was gaunt with exhaustion. His hands, once just calloused, were now perpetually cracked and bleeding. Still, he refused to ask my grandfather for more help. The humiliation was too great. The tension in our little house was palpable. It was in the worried whispers between my parents late at night, in the untouched dinners, in the hollow look in my father's eyes. He started talking about the mansion not with simple bitterness anymore, but with a sense of ownership, of entitlement. "It should be your mother's," he'd mutter to me, as if testing the words out. "He's just one old man. What does he need with all that space, all that money, while your mother suffers?" The idea, the terrible, insidious idea, began to take shape in his mind. I believe it was born on a cold, rainy Tuesday after a particularly grim visit to the doctor. My father came home, soaked to the bone, his face a mask of despair. He found me in the kitchen, trying to do my homework. He sat down heavily at the table and stared at the linoleum floor, his hands trembling slightly. "He's getting older, you know," he said, his voice strangely flat. "Your grandfather. He forgets things." I heard him ask the same question 3 times last Sunday. I didn't think much of it at the time. My grandfather was in his 80s. Forgetting things was normal. But I see now that this was the beginning. This was the first stone he was laying on a very dark path. He wasn't just observing his father-in-law's age. He was looking for weakness. He was searching for a crack in the fortress. A few weeks later, I overheard him on the phone, speaking in a low, conspiratorial tone. I only caught fragments. Words like power of attorney, assessment, and losing his faculties. A cold dread washed over me. I didn't understand the legalities, but I understood the intent. My father wasn't just angry anymore. He was planning something. He was going to try and prove that the king was no longer fit to rule. He wanted to take the kingdom, not by force, but by a quiet, clinical declaration that my grandfather was no longer of sound mind. He wanted to do something terrible, not just to my grandfather, but to the very fabric of our family, all to take his mansion and the fortune within it. And I, his daughter, was standing right in the middle of his path, a silent, terrified witness to his slow descent. The plan, once it had taken root in my father's mind, grew like a thorny, invasive weed, wrapping its tendrils around every aspect of our lives. My teenage years were spent in the shadow of his obsession. The quiet, hard-working man I had adored as a child was slowly being replaced by a ghost, haunted by a single, all-consuming purpose. He began documenting every perceived slip, every moment of forgetfulness from my grandfather. He bought a small notebook, a cheap, spiral-bound one, and he would make entries in it with a furious, scribbling motion after every Sunday visit. Forgot the name of the Prime Minister today, one entry might read. Told the same story about his trip to London in 68 twice in 1 hour. He would show me the notebook, his eyes gleaming with a strange, feverish light. "You see, Helen? It's all here. It's the proof. He's losing it. Anyone can see it." To me, it just looked like an old man being an old man. But my father saw it as ammunition. He began to coach me before our visits. "Helen, if he asks you what day it is, make a note of it. If he seems confused about who you are, even for a second, I need you to tell me exactly what happened." He was trying to turn me into a spy, a co-conspirator in my own grandfather's demise. I felt a profound sense of unease, a sickness in the pit of my stomach. I would nod mutely, not wanting to provoke his anger, but a quiet rebellion was stirring within me. My mother, lost in the fog of her illness, was mostly oblivious to the specifics of my father's plotting. She only knew that his mood had darkened, that he had grown more distant. Their late-night whispers were now arguments, hushed and bitter. "Robert, you're scaring me," I heard her plead one night through their bedroom door. "Whatever you're thinking, please, just let it go. He's still my father." His response was cold and final. "He's the reason you're not getting the care you deserve, Eleanor. I'm doing this for you." He was twisting his resentment into a noble cause, a crusade for his sick wife. But I knew deep down it was about more than that. It was about the work boots on the Persian rug. It was about the word rustic. It was about a lifetime of feeling inadequate. The first major step he took was consulting a lawyer. He came home one evening with a thin briefcase I'd never seen before. He spread papers across the kitchen table, documents filled with dense legal jargon. He explained it to me in simple, chilling terms. He was going to petition the court to have my grandfather declared mentally incompetent. If successful, a conservator would be appointed to manage his affairs. And my father would argue that my mother, as his only child, should have that power, with him acting as her proxy. It was a neat, legal, and utterly brutal way to seize control of everything Arthur Covington owned. It's for the best, Helen, he insisted, misinterpreting the horror on my face as confusion. We'll be able to get your mother the best doctors, the best treatments. And you'll never have to worry about money a day in your life. This house, that ridiculous mansion, it will be ours. I started to actively resist him then in small, subtle ways. When he'd ask me about my grandfather's state of mind, I'd be deliberately vague. He seemed fine to me, Dad. He asked about my schoolwork. He remembered my teacher's name. Each statement was a tiny act of defiance, a small shield I was trying to place around my grandfather. It infuriated my father. "You're not paying attention," he would snap. "You're just like your mother, too soft. You don't see him for what he is." The truth was, I was starting to see my grandfather in a way I never had before. Because of my father's suspicions, I began to watch him more closely, but I wasn't seeing what my father wanted me to see. I saw a man who was profoundly lonely. The great house was no longer a fortress to me, but a gilded cage. He would wander its halls, his footsteps echoing in the silence, his hand trailing along the dusty furniture. He would stand for long moments in front of a portrait of my grandmother, who had passed away years before I was born. His stern facade would soften, and his shoulders would slump. One Sunday, my father sent me on a specific mission. He had heard from a disgruntled former gardener that my grandfather sometimes hid important documents in his study. "He doesn't trust the banks with everything," my father had said, his voice a low hiss. "Go into his study. Tell him you're looking for a book for a school project. See if you can find his will or any financial statements. Just look, don't touch anything. I need to know where he keeps things." My hands were clammy as I knocked on the heavy oak door of the study. "Come in," a voice called out. I found my grandfather sitting not at his imposing desk, but in a worn armchair by the window, a thick book lying unread in his lap. He looked tired. "Grandpa," I started, my voice trembling slightly. "My dad. I was wondering if you had any books about Canadian history. For a school report." He looked at me, and for the first time, I felt like he was truly seeing me, not just as Eleanor's daughter, but as a person. "Of course, Helen. Help yourself." The shelves on the far wall. As I pretended to scan the book titles, my eyes darted around the room. The desk was tidy, almost sterile. There were no papers left out. But my gaze fell upon a small, unlocked wooden box on a side table. It was simple, unadorned, completely out of place amongst the ornate furnishings. My heart hammered against my ribs. This had to be it. My grandfather had closed his eyes, seemingly dozing. With my back to him, my hands shaking, I lifted the lid of the box. It wasn't filled with financial documents or a will. It was filled with letters. Dozens of them, tied in faded silk ribbons. The top one was written in my grandmother's delicate, looping script. But underneath it was another, in my grandfather's sharp, angular hand. It was addressed to her, but it was dated long after she had died. My conscience screamed at me to close the box, but I couldn't. I gently lifted out the letter. It was a confession. It was a lament. "My dearest Beatrice," it began. "Another year gone. The house is so quiet without your laughter. Eleanor came today, with Robert and the girl, Helen. She has your eyes, you know. That same fire. I try to talk to her, but the words fail me. I see so much of you in Eleanor, and it is a constant, bittersweet ache. And the husband, Robert. He looks at me with such hatred. I suppose I have earned it. I don't know how to speak to him. I was raised to believe a man's worth was in his accounts, in his assets. It is a language of numbers, not of the heart. I tried to help them, to give them what I thought they needed, but I have only succeeded in making him feel like less of a man. How do I tell him that I see the way he looks at his daughter, with a love so fierce and proud, and I am envious? I built this empire, Beatrice, but I never learned how to build a family. I am a king in an empty castle, and my only heir is a stranger who despises me. Tears streamed down my face as I read the words. This cold, distant man had a heart that was breaking with loneliness and regret. All the things my father saw as arrogance and disdain were, in fact, a clumsy, misguided attempt to connect, shielded by a lifetime of emotional ineptitude. He wasn't a tyrant. He was a prisoner of his own making. I gently placed the letter back in the box and closed the lid, my hands no longer shaking. A profound sadness settled over me, a grief for the years that had been lost to this misunderstanding, this chasm between two proud, stubborn men. At that moment, I knew I could no longer be a passive observer. My father's plan wasn't just a legal maneuver, it was an act of profound cruelty against a man who was already defeated. I walked out of the study, leaving the history book on the shelf. My grandfather opened his eyes as I passed. "Find what you were looking for, Helen?" he asked, his voice soft. I looked at him, at the lonely old man in the armchair, and I nodded. "Yes," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I think I did." When we got in the car, my father turned to me, his eyes expectant. "Well, did you find anything?" I took a deep breath. The time for silent rebellion was over. "Dad," I said, my voice clearer and stronger than I thought possible. "We need to talk. You have to stop this. You're wrong about him. You're wrong about everything." The battle for my grandfather's kingdom was about to become a war for my father's soul. The confrontation in the car was the first tremor of an earthquake that would shake our family to its foundations. My father didn't take my words well. He slammed his hand on the dashboard, the sudden violence making me flinch. "Wrong," he spat, his face contorted with a mix of fury and betrayal. "After everything he's put us through? After the way he's treated your mother, treated me? You're a child, Helen, you don't understand. I understand that he's a lonely old man." I cried, the words tumbling out. "I understand that you hate him so much you can't see anything else." I read his letters, Dad. Letters to Grandma. "He's not a monster. He's just sad." Letters. He scoffed, a bitter, humorless sound. He probably had his lawyer write them. It's all a performance. Everything with that man is a performance. He refused to believe it. Years of resentment had built a wall around his heart so high and so thick that a simple truth could not penetrate it. He was a man convinced of his own righteousness, and my dissent was, in his eyes, a betrayal of the highest order. The days that followed were the coldest I have ever known. My father and I barely spoke. He moved through our small house like a thundercloud, his silence more oppressive than any argument. He spent his evenings locked away with his legal papers, the faint rustling of documents a constant, grim reminder of the path he was determined to walk. He was finalizing his petition to the court. The hearing was scheduled. The machine was in motion, and I felt powerless to stop it. My mother, sensing the deep rift between us, tried to mediate. From her bed, she would call me over, her hand, thin as a bird's claw, gripping mine. "Be patient with your father, Helen," she'd whisper. "The stress, it's changing him. He loves you." But then she would turn to my father and plead, "Robert, for my sake, don't do this. Don't destroy what's left of this family." He would simply pat her hand and say, "I'm saving this family, Eleanor." He had constructed a reality in which he was the hero, and there was no room for any other narrative. The week before the court date, my father's lawyer advised one final, decisive action. He wanted a signed statement from a family member. He wanted it from me. He wanted me to put in writing all the instances of confusion and memory loss that my father had so diligently recorded in his notebook. My father sat me down at the kitchen table, a pen and a typed document in front of me. "Just sign it, Helen," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "It's the last piece. It will guarantee that we win." I stared at the paper. It was a list of lies and exaggerations, a cruel distortion of an old man's fading memories. My grandfather's sad, lonely face from the study flashed in my mind. The words from his letter echoed in my ears. I am a king in an empty castle. Signing this document would be like locking the castle gates and throwing away the key. No, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I pushed the paper back across the table. His face darkened. What did you say? I said no, I repeated, louder this time, finding a strength I didn't know I possessed. I won't do it. I won't lie. I won't be a part of this. He stood up so abruptly that his chair screeched against the linoleum and toppled over. You ungrateful child, he roared, his voice cracking with emotion. After everything I've done for you, for this family, I am trying to secure your future. I don't want a future that's built on a lie. I shouted back, tears of anger and frustration finally breaking free. I don't want his money if it means destroying him to get it. Can't you see what this is doing to us? To you? You're not the man I knew. My father built things. He didn't tear people down. The words hit him like a physical blow. He staggered back, his face pale. The fury seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a deep, hollow weariness. He looked at me, his daughter, standing against him, and for the first time, I think a crack appeared in his wall of certainty. He said nothing more. He just turned, walked out of the house, and I heard his old truck start up and drive away into the night. He didn't come home that night, or the next. My mother was beside herself with worry. I called his workshop, his friends, but no one had seen him. The court date was 2 days away. I was terrified. Had I pushed him too far? Had my defiance caused him to do something reckless? On the morning of the hearing, he returned. He walked into the house, looking as if he had aged 10 years. His clothes were rumpled, his eyes were red-rimmed, and he smelled of stale coffee and gasoline. He didn't look at me. He walked straight to my mother's bedroom. I stood in the hallway, my heart pounding, straining to hear. Eleanor, he said, his voice raspy and broken. I'm sorry. And then I heard something I hadn't heard in years. I heard my father cry. Not silent, angry tears, but deep, gut-wrenching sobs. The sound of a man whose world had completely fallen apart. He eventually emerged from the room and walked over to the telephone in the hall. He picked up the receiver and dialed the number for his lawyer. I held my breath. It's Robert Anderson, he said, his voice still thick. I'm calling to tell you that I'm withdrawing the petition. The hearing is off. No, there's no explanation needed. It's over. He hung up the phone and finally looked at me. The feverish light was gone from his eyes, replaced by a profound and painful clarity. He didn't have to say a word. I knew that something fundamental had shifted within him during those 2 days he was gone. It was many years later that he told me what had happened. He had driven aimlessly for hours, ending up in a small, forgotten town hours north of Toronto. He'd sat in a dingy 24-hour diner, nursing a single cup of coffee, his mind a whirlwind of anger and confusion. He told me he kept replaying my words in his head. My father built things. He didn't tear people down. He said he looked at his own hands, the carpenter's hands, stained and calloused from a lifetime of honest work. And he realized he was about to use them to sign a document that would demolish a man's life. He was about to become a wrecker. The thought, he said, made him feel physically ill. He spent 2 days wrestling with the demon of his own bitterness, the resentment that had been his constant companion for decades. And in the bleak solitude of that roadside diner, he finally let it go. It wasn't a moment of divine revelation. It was a slow, agonizing surrender. He finally understood that in his quest to take my grandfather's kingdom, he was on the verge of losing his own soul. That was the but then he moment of my story. It wasn't a single, dramatic event, but a quiet, internal collapse of a lifetime of hate. My father wanted to do something terrible to my grandfather, but then he remembered who he was. A builder, not a destroyer. There was no grand reconciliation. My father never became best friends with my grandfather. The years of animosity had carved a canyon between them that was too wide to ever fully cross. But the war was over. A fragile, unspoken truce was declared. The Sunday visits continued, but the air was different. The tension was gone, replaced by a quiet, awkward courtesy. My father would talk about his projects, and my grandfather would listen, really listen this time, sometimes even asking a question or two. He once asked to see my father's workshop, and my father, after a moment of stunned silence, agreed. I saw them standing together amidst the sawdust and the scent of pine, two old men from different worlds, finding a sliver of common ground in the simple act of creation. My mother's health stabilized for a time, and I believe the peace in our home was a better medicine than any my grandfather's money could have bought. My father never took another dollar from him. He found a quiet dignity in his own sufficiency, a pride that no amount of wealth could purchase. My mother passed away a few years later, peacefully, in our little house. My father and grandfather stood side by side at her funeral, a silent, united front of grief. After that, something shifted again. My father began visiting my grandfather on his own, not every Sunday, but now and then. He'd help with small repairs around the mansion, a sticking door, a loose floorboard. He was fixing the great house, not to own it, but as a quiet act of service, of atonement. My father passed away 10 years after my mother. He died in his sleep, a peaceful end for a man who had finally found peace in his life. At his funeral, my grandfather, now frail and leaning heavily on a cane, stood before me. He took my hand, his grip surprisingly firm. "Your father was a good man, Helen," he said, his voice trembling. "A better man than I." It took me too long to see it. When my grandfather finally passed at the age of 98, he left the mansion and everything in it to me. There was no one else. I walked through its silent, cavernous rooms on the day the lawyers gave me the keys. The scent of old leather and lemon polish was still there, but it didn't smell like a museum anymore. It smelled like memory. I wandered into the study and went to the small wooden box. The letters were still there. I found the one I had read all those years ago, and I also found a new one, placed right on top. It was in my grandfather's shaky handwriting, dated just a few months before he died. "My dearest Beatrice," it said, "Robert is gone, and I find myself missing him." Is that strange? To miss the man I spent so long at odds with? He was fixing the porch rail last year. His hands, they were works of art. The things he could create. He was a builder. I spent my life acquiring things, but he spent his life building them. I think, in the end, he was the richer man. I hope he knew that. I hope he forgave me. I stood there in the quiet of the great house, holding the letters, the tangible proof of so much pain and so much love. The mansion was not a prize to be won. It was a witness. It had watched a family tear itself apart and then, slowly, painstakingly, begin to heal. It had absorbed the bitterness, the loneliness, the regret, and finally, the forgiveness. I live here now. It's still too big, still too grand. But it's not a kingdom or a cage. It's just a house. A house full of ghosts and memories. Sometimes, when the sun cuts through the dusty air in the library, I can almost see them, my grandfather in his armchair and my father, standing in the doorway, no longer looking at the house with envy, but with the quiet satisfaction of a builder who has finally made things right. And I understand now that the terrible thing my father almost did was born from a deep and desperate need. In the end, it wasn't the mansion he truly wanted. It was to be seen, to be valued. And in the end, it wasn't the fortune my grandfather was protecting so fiercely. It was his own fragile, lonely heart. The silence out here in the Queensland bush has a weight to it. It's not an empty silence. It's a living thing, woven from the hum of insects, the distant caw of a crow, and the rustle of wind through the ironbark trees. I've lived with this silence my whole life, here on this sun-bleached patch of earth that my father, Frank Williams, fought and bled for. But for the longest time, another place cast a shadow over all of it, a place of noise and frantic energy, a place I barely knew but which defined our existence. That place was my grandfather's mansion in Sydney, a palace of glass and steel overlooking the glittering harbor. And my father, a man of the soil, spent years consumed by a darkness that made him want to shatter that palace, with my billionaire grandfather, Alastair Finch, still inside. My childhood was measured in the rise and fall of the sun and the ever-present anxiety of the rain. We weren't poor in the way city people think of poverty. We had a roof over our heads, food on the table most of the time, and endless open space to run. But we were land poor. Every dollar my father earned from the sheep or the meager crops was poured back into the thirsty ground, into fixing the fences, into servicing the ancient tractor that was his lifeline. His hands told the story of his life. They were maps of hardship, cross-hatched with scars from barbed wire, permanently stained with the red dirt of our land, the knuckles swollen and stiff. He was a proud man, a quiet man, whose self-worth was tied to the yield of his paddocks. And then there was Alistair, my mother's father. He had made his fortune in mining, pulling wealth from the ground in a way my father couldn't comprehend. My father coaxed life from the topsoil. Alistair blasted fortunes from the deep earth. They were two sides of the same Australian coin, one weathered and worn, the other polished and pristine. Once a year, my mother, Catherine, would pack a small suitcase and take the long train journey to Sydney to see him. Sometimes, when I was very young, she took me with her. Entering my grandfather's house was like stepping onto another planet. The air was different, chilled and sterile from the constant air conditioning. The floors were a cold, gleaming black tile that reflected the harbor lights like a captive night sky. Everything was angles and chrome and vast panes of glass. There was no dust. There were no comfortable, worn-in chairs. It was a showroom for a life, not a home where one was lived. My grandfather was much like his house, elegant, imposing, and with a cool, smooth surface that was impossible to get a grip on. He'd pat my head, call me Katie's girl, and give me a gift that was always wildly expensive and utterly impersonal. A porcelain doll I was afraid to touch, a music box that played a tune I'd never heard. He spoke to my mother in low, serious tones about trusts and portfolios, his gaze occasionally flicking to me as if I were a piece of furniture he didn't remember acquiring. He never once asked about my father by name. It was always, "And how is the situation out there, or is he managing to keep things afloat?" The farm was a situation. My father was he. It was a deliberate, surgical removal of my father's identity. My father, in turn, despised him with a slow-burning intensity that was as constant as the Queensland sun. He never went on those trips to Sydney. "I've got work to do," he'd say, his jaw tight. "I don't have time for that nonsense." But I knew it was more than that. He couldn't bear the feeling of being judged, of being found wanting. The one time my grandfather came to the farm was the day the war between them truly began. I was about 12. A sleek, black car that looked like a spaceship appeared on our dusty track, kicking up a plume of red dirt that coated it instantly. My grandfather stepped out in a cream-colored linen suit, looking utterly horrified by the heat, the flies, and the very ground he was standing on. He dabbed at his brow with a silk handkerchief and looked around at the dry, cracked earth. My father stood on the porch, wiping his greasy hands on a rag, his face a mask of stone. My grandfather gestured vaguely at the vast, shimmering expanse. "It's certainly big," he said, the word dripping with condescension. "Quite the hobby you have here, Frank." Hobby. The word landed like a whip crack in the still air. My father's entire life, his sweat and blood and fear, the back-breaking work from before dawn until after dusk, all of it reduced to a hobby. I saw my father's shoulders tense. He didn't say a word. He just gave a short, sharp nod and turned to walk back toward the shearing shed. The visit lasted less than an hour, an agonizing exercise in polite, simmering hatred. As the black car disappeared back down the track, my father spat on the ground. "He thinks we're playing games out here," he muttered, more to himself than to me or my mother. "He has no idea what it takes." No idea. That was the turning point. The bitterness began to fester. The next few years were hard. A relentless drought settled over the region, turning our paddocks to dust bowls. The sheep grew thin. The dam, our precious lifeblood, shrank until it was nothing more than a muddy puddle. The letters from the bank became more frequent, the envelopes a venomous shade of yellow. My father grew quieter, his face etched with lines of worry that hadn't been there before. The silence in our house was no longer peaceful, it was heavy with unspoken fear. My mother would have long, hushed conversations on the phone with my grandfather. I would hear her side of it, her voice strained. No, Dad, we're managing. Frank is very proud. No, I can't ask him to accept that. My grandfather would offer money, but it was always framed as a bailout, a rescue package for his daughter from the poor choices she had made. For my father, accepting it would have been the ultimate surrender, an admission that Alistair was right, that his life's work was just a failing hobby. The idea, the terrible, poisonous idea, began to form on a scorching Tuesday afternoon. My father had just come back from town, his face grim. The bank had given him a final notice. We had 90 days. He slumped into a chair at the kitchen table, looking out the window at the devastated land. He looked like a general surveying a lost battlefield. My mother was on the phone in the other room, speaking to Alistair. Her voice was thin with stress. "The board meeting is on Friday," she said. "Are you sure about the merger?" "It seems so risky." "Alistair, are you listening?" My father's head snapped up. He wasn't looking at the paddock anymore. He was staring at the wall at the faint sound of my mother's voice. A strange, calculating light had entered his eyes. He was listening, and I could see on his face that he wasn't just hearing about a business deal. He was hearing the sound of a weapon being loaded. He was a desperate man, backed into a corner, and he had just been handed away to strike back, not at the farm, but at the heart of my grandfather's gleaming empire. He was going to use my mother's trust, my grandfather's confidence, and he was going to burn it all to the ground. He wanted to do something terrible, to take the mansion not by force, but by ruin. And the first casualty of his war would be my mother's heart. The decision to ruin my grandfather changed my father. It was as if a slow-acting poison had entered his veins, turning the quiet, stoic man I knew into a restless, secretive stranger. The farm, once the center of his universe, became a backdrop to his obsession. He'd still go out and mend the fences, his movements automatic, but his mind was elsewhere. It was in Sydney, in the cool, sterile boardroom of Finch Holdings, plotting a downfall he felt was long overdue. He began to press my mother for information, his questions casual at first, then increasingly pointed. "So, what's the name of that company Alistair is merging with?" he'd ask while she was washing the dishes. "Did he say what the share price was? When is the announcement?" My mother, unsuspecting at first, would answer what she could. She was worried about her father's business, and she thought she was sharing that worry with her husband. She couldn't see the predatory gleam in his eyes. I saw it, though. I was 16, old enough to understand the nuances of betrayal, and what I saw terrified me. I saw him writing down names and numbers in a small, worn ledger he kept hidden in the shed, the same ledger where he used to track feed costs and shearing tallies. Now it held the schematics of his revenge. He was planning to leak the details of the highly sensitive, not yet public merger to a financial journalist. He explained it to me once, in a rare moment of chilling candor, after he'd had a couple of beers. "It's called insider trading, Dottie," he'd said, his voice a low drawl. "Only, we're on the outside. A tip-off to the right person, the news gets out before Alistair is ready, and the whole house of cards comes tumbling down. The stock will plummet. His partners will pull out. He'll lose millions. Maybe everything. It's justice." "It's not justice, Dad," I had whispered, my stomach churning. "It's cruel." "You're using Mum." His face hardened. "Your mother chose this life. She chose me. He's never forgiven her for it. He's been punishing us for it ever since. This isn't about her. It's about him and me. It's about a man's pride. He believed it. He had convinced himself that this act of sabotage was a righteous blow for the common man against the tyranny of wealth. He couldn't see that he was becoming a tyrant himself, holding our family's morality hostage to his own wounded pride. The atmosphere in our small farmhouse grew toxic. My mother finally realized something was wrong. She saw the way he looked at her when she got off the phone with Sydney, the way he'd stopped talking when she entered a room. The argument started, hushed and vicious, in the dead of night. "What are you doing, Frank? I hear you on the phone late at night. Who are you talking to?" "It's nothing, Catherine. Go back to sleep." "It's not nothing. You're scaring me. You look at me like you don't even know me anymore." He had made contact. He'd found a journalist in Sydney, a hungry, ambitious man known for breaking big, damaging stories. My father would drive into the nearest town and use a public payphone, feeding this man snippets of information, stoking his interest. The journalist was hooked. The story was being prepared. All he needed was the final, concrete proof, the exact date and time of the official announcement. My father knew my grandfather would tell my mother that information first, as a courtesy, a day or two before the public release. That phone call would be the final trigger. My father became a hawk, watching the telephone, waiting for it to ring. I felt like I was living in a suspense film, except the villain was my own father and the impending disaster was one of his own making. I tried to reason with him again, a few days before the final piece of information was expected. I found him in the shearing shed, sharpening the blades, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone grating on my nerves. "Dad, please," I begged. "It's not too late to stop this. Think about what will happen. It won't just hurt Grandpa. It will destroy Mom. It will destroy us." He stopped sharpening and looked at me, his eyes cold. "What's been destroyed is my life's work," he said flatly. "This land." He could have helped. Not with a handout, but with respect. He could have treated me like a man. He never did. Now he'll see what this man can do. He had passed the point of no return. His heart was hardened against any appeal to compassion. The phone call came on a Thursday morning. It was a blistering hot day, the air thick with the smell of dust and dying eucalyptus. I was in my room, trying to read, but the tension in the house was a physical presence. I heard the phone ring and then my mother's soft voice. I saw my father stiffen, his head cocked as he listened from the kitchen. This was it. My mother hung up the phone and walked into the kitchen, her face pale. "Dad's announcing the Kestrel merger on Monday," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He sounds nervous. He's risked a lot on this." My father didn't even look at her. He just nodded slowly, a grim smile touching his lips. He picked up his hat from the hook by the door. "Got to go into town," he said. "Need to pick up a part for the water pump." I knew where he was going. He was going to the payphone. He was going to light the fuse. As he walked out the door, I felt a wave of despair so profound it almost buckled my knees. My family was about to be irrevocably broken. But then, something happened. Something that had nothing to do with money or mergers or mansions. As my father was getting into his Uda, a strange orange glow appeared on the western horizon. A flock of galahs, hundreds of them, screeched past the house, flying low and fast. An eerie, unnatural twilight began to descend, and the air, already thick, became acrid with the smell of smoke. It wasn't the familiar smell of a neighbor burning off, it was something else. Something vast and angry. My father stopped, his hand on the car door, and stared at the horizon. We all did. The radio, which was always on in the kitchen, crackled to life with an emergency broadcast. A bushfire, fanned by strong westerly winds, had broken out in the Malign National Park and was moving east at an incredible speed. It was heading directly for us. In an instant, everything changed. The world of Sydney, of finance, of revenge, it all evaporated like a drop of water on a hot plate. The only thing that mattered was the wall of fire and smoke rolling towards us across the paddocks. The complex, man-made crisis of my father's creation was about to be dwarfed by the raw, indiscriminate fury of nature. The part for the water pump was forgotten. The phone call to the journalist was forgotten. There was only the fire. My father, the farmer, the man of the land, slammed the car door shut. His face, which moments before had been a mask of cold vengeance, was now alive with a different kind of intensity. It was the face of a man about to fight for his home. The terrible thing he was about to do was consumed by a far more immediate and terrible reality. The bushfire was a living monster. It roared. It was a sound I will never forget, a deep, guttural rumble that seemed to come from the bowels of the earth. The sky turned a sickening shade of orange-black, and ash began to fall like a filthy snow. The heat was a physical blow, even from a distance. My father, transformed back into the man I recognized, was a whirlwind of frantic, focused action. "Dottie, get the old blankets. Soak them in the horse trough. Catherine, fill every bucket, every container we have with water." Now, there was no more bitterness in his voice, no more resentment. There was only the urgent, desperate need to survive. We worked in a kind of fluid panic, our movements synchronized by adrenaline and fear. We ran hoses to the roof of the house, drenched the ground around the shearing shed, and moved the last of the terrified sheep into the smallest, barest paddock, a desperate gamble that the fire might pass around it. My father, his face already streaked with sweat and grime, worked with a ferocity I had never seen. He was no longer fighting a distant billionaire. He was fighting a physical embodiment of ruin. The fire hit the edge of our property with a terrifying explosion of sound and light as a line of gum trees went up like Roman candles. The heat was immense, stealing the air from our lungs. My father, his face wrapped in a wet cloth, stood on the porch with a hose, spraying the walls, his knuckles white as he gripped the nozzle. My mother and I were a bucket brigade, refilling containers from the dwindling tank, our arms aching, our eyes streaming from the smoke. For hours, we fought. Time ceased to have meaning. There was only the heat, the smoke, the roar, and the desperate, repetitive motions of our fight. I remember seeing the shearing shed, my father's sanctuary, catch fire. I cried out, but he just shook his head, his eyes grim. Let it go. We saved the house. The shed where he had plotted his revenge was consumed by the flames, its contents, including the ledger with his secret notes, turning to ash. It was a violent, brutal cleansing. We saved the house. By some miracle, and by my father's sheer, stubborn will, the flames passed around it, leaving a blackened, smoldering landscape in their wake. As the fire front moved on, an apocalyptic silence descended, broken only by the crackle of dying embers and our own ragged breaths. We collapsed on the porch, exhausted, defeated, but alive. The world was a monochrome of black and gray. Our paddocks were gone. The fences were gone. The shed was a smoking ruin. We had survived, but it felt like we had lost everything. The phone lines were dead. The roads were closed. We were utterly alone in our bubble of devastation. For 2 days, we lived in a state of shock, tending to the few surviving sheep, salvaging what we could. My father was silent, but it was a different silence now. It was the hollow silence of a man who has stared into the abyss and has seen his own life's work turn to cinders. His grand plan of revenge seemed like a foolish, childish fantasy from another lifetime. What good was a ruined enemy when his own world was in ashes? On the 3rd day, we heard a strange noise. A rhythmic womp 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 that grew steadily louder. We looked up into the smoky sky and saw it, a helicopter, descending towards our one remaining patch of green lawn. It was a sleek, expensive-looking machine, the kind you see in movies, utterly alien in our ruined world. It landed, and the side door slid open. And out stepped my grandfather, Alistair Finch. He was not wearing a linen suit. He was wearing practical trousers, work boots, and a face etched with a worry so deep it looked like it had been carved there. He ignored the dirt, the lingering smoke, the devastation. He just ran towards us. He ran to my mother first, wrapping her in an embrace so fierce it lifted her off her feet. "Catherine." "Thank God," he breathed, his voice thick with an emotion I had never heard from him. Then he turned to my father. My father stood there, covered in soot from head to toe, his clothes torn, his face a mask of exhaustion and shame. The two men stood facing each other amidst the wreckage of my father's life. The billionaire and the broken farmer. My father looked at Alistair, at the genuine, raw relief on his face, and my father broke. He didn't cry. He just seemed to deflate, all the fight, all the pride, all the hate draining out of him, leaving him hollow. "I was going to ruin you," my father said, his voice a hoarse whisper that was nearly lost in the wind. "Monday. I had it all planned. I was going to destroy you." My grandfather looked at him, and then he looked around at the blackened earth. He seemed to finally understand the depth of my father's desperation. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shocked. He just looked incredibly sad. "The merger," my grandfather said quietly. "I pulled out. I canceled it 2 days ago." My father stared at him, confused. "What?" "Why?" "Because of this," Alistair said, gesturing to the sky, the smoke. "I heard on the news the fires were heading this way. The lines were down. I couldn't reach you. Nothing else mattered. The deal, the money, it was just noise. I had to get here. I had to know you were all safe. He looked my father directly in the eye. I had to know my daughter was safe. In that moment, the wall between them, a wall built over 20 years of pride and misunderstanding and hurt, finally crumbled to dust, just like the paddocks around us. My father had wanted to do something terrible to my grandfather. But then, my grandfather, in his own way, had done something extraordinary. He hadn't sent money. He hadn't sent help. He had come himself. He had chosen family over fortune. And in doing so, he had saved my father not from the fire, but from himself. The rebuilding began the next day. It was not a process of checks and contractors, but of hands and sweat. Alistair's helicopter became a shuttle, bringing in not just food and water, but rolls of fencing wire, timber, bags of feed, and 2 strapping young men who were his groundskeepers in Sydney. But my grandfather didn't just direct, he stayed. He slept on our lumpy spare mattress, a man used to silk sheets and silence, now surrounded by the sounds of a recovering farm. The first few days were awkward. My father, raw with shame, could barely look at him. My grandfather, for his part, was clumsy and out of his element, a creature of the boardroom trying to navigate a world of dirt and labor. But the fire had burned away the need for pretense. There was too much work to do for pride to get in the way. I will forever carry the image in my mind of my father and my grandfather rebuilding the fence along the main paddock. My father, with his innate, physical knowledge, dug the post holes with a practiced rhythm. My grandfather, his soft hands already blistering, would help position the heavy ironbark posts. They barely spoke, but a new language was forming between them, a language of shared effort, of passing a hammer, of coiling wire, of a nod that meant good enough. One afternoon, I brought them out a jug of water. They were leaning against a newly set post, catching their breath. Alistair was looking at my father's hands. "You know," he said, his voice quiet, "I've spent my life signing documents that move mountains of money. My signature has built skyscrapers, bought companies. But I've never actually built anything. Not with my hands." He looked down at his own palms, raw and red. "There's an honesty in this that I never understood." My father looked at him. "There's a terror in it, too," he said, his voice rough. "When you know it can all be taken away in a day. By the weather. By the banks." "I know," Alistair said. And for the first time, I think he truly did. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch together, staring out at the blackened landscape. They started to talk. Not about the past, not about the bitterness. My father talked about the land, about the way you can read the clouds, about the subtle signs of recovery already beginning to show, a tiny green shoot pushing through the charcoal. My grandfather talked about his early days in the mines, the grit and the danger, stories I'd never heard, stories that painted a picture of a man who had also been young and hungry and had fought his own battles. He wasn't the polished tycoon from the mansion. He was Alistair Finch, a man who had also known struggle. My mother watched all of this with a quiet, wondrous disbelief. The 2 men she loved, the 2 opposing poles of her life, were finally finding their way to the same point on the map. The strain that had lined her face for years began to soften. Her laughter, something I hadn't heard in a long time, started to return. Alistair stayed for 3 weeks. When his helicopter finally lifted off, he wasn't leaving an enemy behind. He was leaving a partner. He didn't offer a bailout. He offered an investment. He set up a trust, not just to rebuild the farm, but to modernize it, to make it drought-proof with new irrigation systems and sustainable practices. "This is Finch land now, too," he'd said to my father, clapping him on the shoulder. "It's a family business." My father, the proudest man I have ever known, did not refuse. He accepted it not as charity, but as the handshake that sealed a truce, a partnership born from the ashes. I inherited this farm when my father passed away, many years later. My grandfather was there at his funeral, an old, stooped man, crying without shame for the son-in-law he had almost lost, and had been so lucky to find. When Alistair died a few years after that, his will held a final surprise. The grand mansion in Sydney was to be sold, and the proceeds were to be placed into the trust for the farm. His note to me was simple: "A home is where a family is, Dorothy." not where the money is. I live here now in the house that survived the fire. The land is green again. The new fences are strong. The dam is full. The silence is still here, but it's different. It's not heavy with resentment anymore. It's filled with peace. Sometimes, when I'm out checking the fences my father and grandfather built together, I'll run my hand over the weathered wood of a post. I can feel the story in it. The story of two stubborn, proud men, of a terrible, desperate plan, and of the fire that burned everything away to reveal the only thing that truly mattered. The fire took almost everything we had, but it gave us back my father. It gave us back our family. It taught us that sometimes, the only way to rebuild a future is to let the past burn completely to the ground. The taste of salt on my lips is the first memory I have. It was the taste of my father's work, of our life in our tiny Cornish cottage, of everything that was real and hard-won. But just up the cliff, perched like a predator made of glass and steel, was another world. A world that tasted of nothing at all. That was my grandfather's mansion, a place so sterile and vast it seemed to suck the very flavor from the air. My father, Thomas Morgan, spent most of his days on the sea, his hands raw from the nets, fighting for a living. But he spent his nights staring up at that mansion, his heart slowly filling with a poison so potent it threatened to consume us all. He was a good man, my father, but even the best of men can be broken by the weight of another man's shadow. And my grandfather, the billionaire industrialist Julian Croft, cast the longest shadow I have ever known. Our life was governed by the tides. We lived in a small, stone cottage in a fishing village tucked into a cove, where the houses huddled together as if for warmth against the relentless Atlantic winds. Our home smelled of damp wool, wood smoke, and the faint, ever-present perfume of the sea. My father's boat, a tired old trawler named the Sea Serpent, was his pride and his burden. It was our livelihood, but it was also a hungry beast, constantly demanding repairs we couldn't afford. My father's face was a map of his life, his skin weathered and creased by sun and sea spray, his eyes the pale blue of a winter sky, often clouded with worry. My mother, Amelia, was the quiet heart of our family. She was Julian Croft's only child, a gentle soul who had traded a life of unimaginable luxury for love, for a fisherman with kind eyes and calloused hands. Her health was as fragile as a sea-worn piece of glass. A lingering weakness in her lungs, a souvenir from a childhood illness, made the damp Cornish air a constant trial. She moved through our small rooms with a quiet grace, her love for my father a tangible thing, a warm blanket against the cold anxieties that pressed in on us. Once a month, the sleek, black car would glide down our narrow lane, a silent, ravenous creature from another world. My grandfather would visit. He never got out of the car. He would send his driver, a man with a blank face, to the door to summon my mother. She would go and sit in the hushed leather interior for 20 minutes, an audience with her own father. Sometimes she would return with her eyes red-rimmed, a check folded tightly in her hand. My grandfather never spoke to my father. He never acknowledged his existence beyond a curt nod if their paths happened to cross. To Julian Croft, my father was not a son-in-law. He was a regrettable circumstance his daughter had chosen. The humiliation ate at my father like acid. He would watch the black car disappear up the winding road towards the cliff-top mansion, and his jaw would set, the muscles twitching. He called the mansion the Prism. It was an apt name. It was a structure of sharp angles and vast, unblinking windows that captured the light and fractured it, but seemed to possess no warmth or life of its own. "He sits up there in his glass box," my father would mutter, staring at the distant lights, looking down on the rest of us like we're ants. The breaking point came during a particularly harsh winter. The engine on the Sea Serpent finally gave out. It wasn't a repair job. It needed a full replacement. The cost was astronomical, an impossible sum. At the same time, my mother's cough grew worse, and the doctor spoke of specialist treatments in London, of private clinics and costs that made the boat engine seem like a pittance. We were drowning. My father, a man who had never bowed his head to anyone, did the hardest thing of his life. He walked up the cliff path to the Prism. I watched him go, his shoulders set, his worn jacket pulled tight against the wind. He was gone for an hour. He came back a changed man. The hope had been extinguished from his eyes, replaced by a cold, hard emptiness. He wouldn't tell my mother what was said. He just sat at our small kitchen table and stared at his hands, those strong, capable hands that now seemed so utterly useless. Later, he told me. He had stood before my grandfather in a room that was bigger than our entire cottage. He had laid out the situation, swallowing his pride, and asked for a loan. Not a gift, a loan. He would pay back every penny. My grandfather had listened, his face impassive. Then he had looked at my father's work boots, at the flecks of dried mud on the pristine white marble floor. Amelia made her choice, Thomas, he had said, his voice as cold as the room. She chose this, life. It is not my place to subsidize it. If you are not a capable provider, perhaps you should encourage her to reconsider her position. He had then turned away, dismissing my father as if he were a servant. That was the moment the goodness in my father began to die. The quiet resentment hardened into a sharp and glittering hatred. He was no longer just a man struggling to survive. He was a man plotting a war. He started watching my grandfather, reading articles about him in the financial papers he'd buy in town. He learned about his passions, his collections. And he found a weakness. My grandfather was an avid collector of rare antiquities, a passion that occasionally brushed against the gray edges of the law, acquiring items with murky histories. The terrible plan was born from this knowledge. My father decided he would not just wound my grandfather, he would cage him. He would frame him. He found a man in a pub in Penzance, a shady character who could get things. He commissioned a forgery, a perfect replica of a priceless Roman brooch that had been stolen from a museum in Italy years ago. His plan was meticulous, and it was monstrous. He would break into the prism, into the private gallery where my grandfather kept his treasures. He would plant the fake brooch amongst the collection. And then he would make an anonymous phone call to the Art and Antiquities Squad. The scandal would be enormous. A billionaire industrialist found in possession of stolen artifacts. His reputation would be shattered. The legal morass would consume his time and his fortune. In the ensuing chaos, my father reasoned, he would be able to force my grandfather's hand, to gain control of my mother's inheritance, to save his family by destroying hers. He was going to do something terrible, and the first brick he would use to build his new life would be a lie designed to send an old man to prison. The forgery of the Roman brooch became a dark idol in our house. My father kept it hidden in his toolbox, wrapped in an oily rag. Sometimes, late at night, I would see a light on in the shed, and I would know he was in there, staring at it. He would hold it in his palm, a small, intricate thing of fake gold and colored glass, and I could see the terrible satisfaction in his eyes. It was his weapon, his key to a different life, and it was changing him day by day. The easy laughter he once shared with my mother vanished. He became quiet, watchful, and coiled as tight as a spring. He needed me. That was the part that twisted the knife in my own heart. The gallery in the prism was on the ground floor, but its security was formidable. The windows had sensors, the doors were complex. But there was one way, and that was less guarded. A small service door in a utility corridor that led from the kitchens. My father's plan required it to be unlocked from the inside. "Joyce," he said to me one evening, his voice a low, persuasive whisper. "Next time we go up there, for your mother's visit, I need you to do something for me. A game. Can you play a game for your old dad?" I was 15, and I was not a fool. I knew this was no game. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, my voice trembling. "There's a little pantry off the kitchen," he explained, his eyes avoiding mine. "There's a door in the back of it. I just need you to slip the bolt. Just for a little while. No one will ever know." He was asking me to be his accomplice. He was asking me to betray my grandfather, to betray my own mother who sat in the next room, coughing softly, oblivious to the conspiracy being hatched in her own home. A cold dread, heavy and suffocating, settled over me. "Why?" I asked, though I already knew. "It's for her," he said, gesturing with his head towards the living room. "It's for us. So we don't have to live like this anymore. So your mother can get the best care. He owes us, Joyce." He owes us for every day of worry, for every night I've laid awake wondering how we'll survive. He had framed his vengeance as a righteous act of love, and the lie was so powerful that I think he had come to believe it himself. I didn't give him an answer. I couldn't. For the next week, I lived in a state of silent terror. The day of my mother's monthly visit loomed like a death sentence. I loved my father. I saw his pain, his humiliation. I had stood by his side on the windy quay, my small hand in his rough one, and I had felt his despair as he looked at his broken boat. But what he was asking was a step into a darkness from which I knew we could never return. The day arrived, gray and drizzly. My father was a knot of nervous energy. He didn't look at me in the car, the rickety old Ford we drove for trips on land, but I could feel his expectation, his pressure, like a physical weight in the small space. We drove up the winding cliff road. The prism loomed through the mist, its glass walls weeping with rain, looking more like a prison than a palace. My mother went to see my grandfather in his study, a vast, white room with a single desk and a chair facing the tumultuous sea. It was the only room in the house that felt personal, and it was the most desolate. My father said he was going to wait in the car, but I knew he was lurking somewhere outside, waiting. I was left in the kitchen with the housekeeper, a kind woman named Mrs. Gable. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. The pantry door was right there. A simple brass bolt. One quick movement was all it would take. Making an excuse about needing a glass of water, I slipped into the pantry. It smelled of dried herbs and floor polish. The service door was at the back, just as my father had described. My hand hovered over the bolt, shaking. I thought of my father's desperate face. I thought of my mother's tired smile. And then I thought of my grandfather, sitting alone in his white room, staring at the gray sea. Was he a monster? Or was he just a man who had forgotten how to love? I couldn't do it. I backed out of the pantry, my face flushed with a mixture of fear and defiance. I spent the rest of the visit in a daze, waiting for the inevitable fallout. When we left, my father was waiting by the car, his face dark with fury. He knew. He didn't say a word until we were halfway down the cliff road. He pulled the car over, screeching to a halt. "You failed me," he hissed, his voice venomous with betrayal. "I gave you one simple thing to do, Joyce. For your mother." "It was wrong, Dad." I cried, tears I hadn't realized I was holding back now streaming down my face. "It's not for Mum, it's for you. It's for your pride. It's ugly and it's cruel and I won't be a part of it." "Fine," he said, his voice dangerously calm. He put the car back in gear and started driving again. "Fine. You've made your choice. You chose his world over ours. I'll do it myself. I don't need a coward for a daughter." The words struck me like a slap. He had cast me out. The bond between us, the thing I had cherished my whole life, felt like it had just snapped. The rest of the drive home was a silent, wretched eternity. That night, I knew he would go. A storm was rolling in, the wind howling around our little cottage, the waves crashing against the seawall. It was the perfect cover. Around midnight, I saw him slip out of the house, a dark shape against the churning gray. He was dressed in black, a wool cap pulled down over his face. In his pocket, I knew, was the fake Roman brooch. He was going to climb the cliff path in the teeth of the storm. He was going to break into that house and plant the seed of my grandfather's destruction. I sat in the dark, listening to the storm and my mother's shallow breathing in the next room. I felt utterly helpless. My father was walking into a self-made hell, and he was dragging all of us down with him. But then, as he was about to commit the worst act of his life, a different kind of storm, one that had been brewing inside my grandfather for decades, was about to break in the most unexpected way. The storm that night was biblical. It threw itself against the Cornish coast with a fury that rattled the windows of our cottage and sent waves crashing over the harbor wall. My father was out in it, a ghost moving through the wind and rain on his dark errand. I sat at my window, watching the lights of the prism flicker up on the cliff, imagining him scaling the slick rocks, his heart full of hate. I prayed for him to turn back, but I knew the tide of his anger was too strong. He returned hours later, just before dawn. The storm had begun to recede, leaving a bruised, weeping sky in its wake. He didn't slip back in like a thief. The front door opened and he stood there, silhouetted against the gray morning light. He was soaked to the bone, his face pale and streaked with rain. But it was his eyes that stopped my heart. The cold, hard fury was gone. In its place was a look of such profound shock and confusion. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost. In his hand, he was not holding the fake brooch. He was clutching a small, leather-bound book. He walked past me as if in a trance and went into the kitchen. He sank into a chair, placing the book on the table with a trembling hand. He stared at it, his breathing ragged. "What happened?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Dad, what is that?" He looked up at me, and his face crumpled. "I got in," he said, his voice a hoarse croak. "The service door. It was unlocked. He must have left it." I went to the gallery. I was there, Joyce. I had the brooch in my hand. He stopped, swallowing hard, as if the words themselves were stones in his throat. "The lights came on," he continued. I froze. I thought it was a security guard, but it was him. It was your grandfather. He was standing there in his dressing gown. He just looked at me. He wasn't angry. He wasn't scared. He just looked tired. So terribly tired. My father's story tumbled out, fragmented and chaotic. My grandfather had simply stood there in the doorway of his own gallery, watching the man who had come to destroy him. He hadn't called the police. He hadn't shouted. He had just said one word, "Thomas." He walked over to me, my father choked out. I thought he was going to hit me. I deserved it. But he pointed to the display case I was standing in front of. The one with his ship models. It was a part of the collection my father had never cared about. Intricate, perfect models of old sailing ships. "Look," my grandfather had said, his voice raspy with age. He pointed to the largest model, a beautiful replica of a 19th century fishing trawler. On its stern, in tiny, perfect letters, was a name, the Eleanor. Not my mother's name, his wife's name. My grandmother, who had died before I was born. My father was a fisherman, Thomas, my grandfather had said, his voice soft in the cavernous room. "Just like you. Not here. In a small village in Scotland. He was lost at sea when I was 10. This was his boat. I build them to remember him. To remember where I came from." My father stared at me, his eyes wide with the remembered shock. "The whole time," he whispered, "all those years I thought he was looking down on me. He was seeing his own father. He wasn't looking at me with contempt, Joyce. It was something else. Regret. Sadness." My grandfather had then walked over to a small desk in the corner of the gallery and picked up the leather-bound book. He had held it out to my father. "He gave it to me," my father said, looking at the book on our kitchen table as if it were a bomb. He said, "I think it's time you read this." With a shaking hand, my father opened the book. It was a journal. My grandfather's journal. The entries went back 30 years. My father flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the neat, disciplined script. He stopped on a page dated the week after my parents were married. His breath hitched. He read the words aloud, his voice cracking. "Amelia married her fisherman today. A good man, I think. Strong hands." He looks at her with a light in his eyes I have not seen in a long time. I am afraid for them. I am afraid his pride will never allow me to help them. I have seen pride sink more men than any storm. I will have to find another way. A quiet way. To ensure my daughter and the man she loves are safe. The room was silent save for the ticking of the clock and the sound of my father's heart breaking. He turned the pages frantically. Entry after entry detailed my grandfather's secret war against my father's hardship. The anonymous benefactor who helped the local fishermen's co-op secure a new ice machine, allowing them all to get better prices for their catch. The charitable donation to the Regional Health Trust that funded a new respiratory wing at the hospital, the very wing where my mother received her treatment. And the most damning entry of all, from a few weeks ago, the engine on Thomas's boat is gone. He will be too proud to ask me. I have arranged for the supply company in Plymouth to call him. They will tell him there has been a clerical error and that a new engine is waiting for him, fully paid for, a canceled order from a larger company. He must never know it came from me. His dignity is all he has. My father dropped his head into his hands, and a sound of pure agony was torn from his throat. It was the sound of a lifetime of resentment being ripped out by the roots. The man he had hated, the man he had just tried to ruin, had been his silent, secret guardian angel all along. His acts of kindness were so deeply hidden, so carefully designed to protect my father's pride, that they had been completely invisible. They had looked like indifference. They had looked like contempt. My father's plan to do something terrible had been stopped. Not by a locked door, not by a security guard, but by a truth so profound it had completely unmade him. He had gone up that cliff a soldier bent on vengeance. He had come down a man drowning in shame. There was no grand confrontation the next day. There was only a quiet, humble pilgrimage. My father, his face gray with exhaustion and sleeplessness, walked back up the cliff path. He didn't take the brooch. He took the journal. He found my grandfather on the terrace, watching the fishing boats, my father's friends and colleagues, heading out into the calm, post-storm waters. My father didn't say a word. He just held out the journal. My grandfather took it. Their eyes met. And in that silent gaze, a lifetime of misunderstanding was laid to rest. "I called the supplier in Plymouth this morning," my grandfather said quietly, not looking at my father. "I told them to deliver the engine today. Julian." My father started, his voice thick. "My father would have been proud of you, Thomas," my grandfather interrupted softly. "You're a good fisherman. And a good father." He finally turned to look at my father, and for the first time, he smiled. It was a small, sad, tired smile, but it was real. "Now," he said, clapping his hands together softly, "I believe your wife is in need of that specialist in London. I'll make the arrangements." And that was it. The war was over. I am an old woman now. I still live in that stone cottage by the sea. The taste of salt is still on my lips. My father fished the sea serpent with its new engine for another 20 years. My mother lived to see her own grandchildren, her health managed by the best doctors her father's love could provide. My father and my grandfather never became easy friends. There were too many years of silence and pain for that. But they found a peace. They would sit together on the terrace of the Prism, two old men, one in a worn fisherman's sweater, the other in fine cashmere, and watch the sea. They would talk about tides and winds and the price of fish. They would talk about the past, about their fathers, about the different kinds of storms a man must weather in his life. When my grandfather died, he left the Prism not to a foundation or a museum, but to the fishermen's trust of our village, to be used as a convalescent home for those who had spent their lives working the sea. The glass box on the cliff became a place of healing. My father passed away peacefully in his own bed, looking out at the water that had given him his living and nearly cost him his soul. Before he died, he gave me that little leather-bound journal. I keep it in a drawer with my own most precious things. It's a reminder that the greatest treasures are often hidden, not in a gallery or a vault, but in the quiet, unseen actions of a conflicted heart. And it reminds me that pride can build walls so high they block out the sun, but that sometimes, if you are very, very lucky, a storm comes along that is powerful enough to wash them all away.